we had to switch our technology midstream, so that created some problems. But hopefully, we should all be smooth now. So, going here. Here's a look at the topics we'll be covering today. We'll talk about the importance of knowing your funder and grant program, how to describe your project clearly. That's going to be what we're going to spend most of our time on. We'll talk about other sections that you commonly encounter in grant proposals, how to prepare a good list of tasks and budget, and then we will wrap things up. So this webinar is intended to share helpful approaches to writing grant proposals. It's not specific to Coastal Conservancy grant programs, although we will be giving you some examples from Conservancy grant programs. If you've worked with us, you know that the Conservancy provides grants, but you may not know that we also obtain grants from federal, state, and private sources for projects. So we have a lot of collective experience in writing proposals for all kinds of funders, and we're going to be sharing that experience in today's webinar. There will be two of us presenting the webinar today, and we're going to introduce ourselves now. I'm Joel Gerwine, and I'm the grants manager here at the Coastal Conservancy. That means I spend a lot of my time helping other Conservancy staff find grant opportunities and submit proposals. And I also manage projects on the North Coast and review grant proposals.
And I'm Evan Sloan. I'm a project manager in the South Coast region. I review grant proposals to the Conservancy, and I have also prepared and submitted successful proposals to other funders.
Today we'll be providing lots of examples drawn from actual projects and proposals, and just like on that old Dragnet TV show, we have changed the names of projects and organizations when appropriate in order to protect the innocent. During the webinar, we'll be conducting a few simple polls. These are intended to keep you awake, make things more fun, and help us determine whether we are getting our points across, and we'll be starting with a couple of those in a moment just to better know who's on the call. We do have quite a few people registered for the webinar, so that may limit our ability to answer questions today. But if you have a question, please go ahead and type it into the chat box. And if we have time at the end of the webinar, which we probably will, we will try to answer those questions. If we don't have time during the webinar, we will try to write answers to common questions afterwards and provide those to everyone who signed up. We're also trying to record this webinar, and we will share that recording if we're successful. If not, we will at least make this PowerPoint available to everybody along with the notes on the PowerPoint, which include most everything that we're going to be saying. So that should be almost as good as a recording, even if that recording doesn't quite work out. So now, before we get started with the webinar content, we're going to ask for a little information about you through the polling. So we've opened up a poll just asking about how many grants you've written, just your experience with grant writing. I can see people are all filling those out. Just give you a little bit longer to vote, and then we will share those results. All right. Okay, so we're going to close the poll now and share the results. It looks like we have a real range of experience here. Some people are very experienced in grant writing, so we could probably just turn the webinar over to you, but also some people who are just getting started with it. Hopefully everyone will get something useful out of today's webinar. We have one more poll we want to do now, just to ask about the type of organization that you're working for. So we have that up on the screen, and if people could just fill that in. I see people are getting started filling in that poll. We'll just give it another minute here. And we will share the poll results now. So it looks like we have mostly representatives from nonprofits and some local agencies, state and federal agencies, and some private sector. So a great range of people on the call and somewhat representative of the kinds of partners we work with at the Conservancy. Makes sense. All right, so let me get into the meat of the presentation now. This webinar will be sharing tips from the funder's perspective. So as a grant applicant, you want to keep in mind that funders will be reviewing lots and lots of applications, likely on top of other work that they're trying to get done, and also under deadline. So that makes reviewers want proposals that are clear and concise with no extraneous information. And that kind of perspective leads to 3 key points that we're going to be going into detail about during the webinar, but I'm just going to highlight them here to help underscore their importance. So those 3 points are: don't bury the lead, be concise but provide necessary detail, and don't oversell your project. So before you even start writing your grant proposal, you want to make sure that your project is a good fit for the funding agency and the grant program. So that means you need to get to know your funder, including the agency's basic mission and goals and the specific grant program's focus and priorities. One of the ways to do that is to really look at what they've given grants to in the past, those past funding awards. You want to make sure that their program priorities fit with your project. The grant amount makes it worth your while, it's a good fit for your budget, and all those other characteristics up there in that bullet point are really a good fit. You also want to pay attention to what level of project development, permitting, or environmental documentation is required. Conservancy staff have had the experience of developing almost a full application for a project that was in the planning stages, only to realize that CEQA and NEPA, that environmental documentation and permitting, had to be completed for that particular grant program. If they had waited a year to write the proposal, then the project would have been in the right phase for that grant program, and they could have saved themselves a lot of time and effort. So that's something you definitely want to pay attention to. And then you also, right off the bat, want to take a quick look at the scoring criteria and make sure your project will score well on the most important of those scoring criteria. If you're not sure whether your project is a good fit for a particular grant program or funder, don't be afraid to get in touch with the funder directly to find out whether they think it seems like a good fit. But you do want to respect their time. So you should send an email with basic project information and your questions. And if you think a phone call would be helpful, then ask to schedule one in the email. That way you can get the information you need without inundating your funder with questions and phone calls. Another part of getting to know your funder and grant program is understanding their specific language and terminology. It's very important to get to know an agency's key terms and the specific plans and policies that they want to see referenced in your grant proposal. You can often find this information in the request for proposals. So just as an example, some agencies might use the term restoration broadly to include things like plantings and removing invasives. Well, another agency might make a really sharp distinction between what they consider enhancement activities, which might be something like removing invasives, and restoration activities, which might only be land altering construction and grading. So you want to pay attention to things like that. Also, don't be afraid to use the exact key terms from the RFP. That's a good thing. Often funders are looking for that. So now I just want to walk through a couple of examples of how one type of project could be framed differently for different funders. So let's take a wetland restoration project. And let's say you were going to be applying to the Coastal Conservancy for this wetland restoration. You might want to frame your project in terms of recommendations in the State Coastal Act and the San Francisco Bay Plan. You might want to focus on public access components of your restoration project because that's part of the Conservancy's mission. And you might want to highlight strong local partnerships. On the other hand, if you were applying to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's National Coastal Wetlands Conservation Program, you might want to focus that restoration on nationally declining wetland types, which is important based on the legislation and ranking criteria for that program. And you might want to really limit the expenditures that you are presenting in that project budget for public access because that grant program is very focused on just the wetlands restoration itself. Let's take a climate adaptation project. If you're applying to the Ocean Protection Council, you might want to be sure to provide a strong statewide context for your project and talk about how it might be a model for other areas across the state. And you might also want to talk about how the deliverables from your project could be incorporated into local coastal programs. On the other hand, if you're applying for that same project to the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, you might want to focus on state-listed species and species of special concern. So again, you can see how you need to be creative and find a unique nexus between your project and the specific agency that you're applying to. Okay, so when you're sitting down to write your proposal, you need to start with figuring out what your project goal and objectives are. That's something you do before you would even begin to write the rest of the proposal. So goals are going to be broad, overarching principles that guide your decision making. And a goal can be aspirational and somewhat vague. You may not know when you've achieved your goal. In contrast, objectives are specific, measurable steps that can be taken to make progress towards the goal. And many funders now are asking applicants to use the SMART objective format, which stands for specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound. And some funders are even moving towards drop-down menus for objectives to quantify common objectives like acres of salt marsh restored. Defining your objectives will help you develop your project tasks, which we'll talk about later. So let me give an example of a goal and objective. Here you can see a real broad goal to restore a resilient and healthy groovy river. Again, you wouldn't necessarily know when you have achieved that goal, but if you look at the objectives underneath that goal, they're very clear, time-bound, and quantified. We know exactly how many shopping carts and auto bodies we're planning to take out of the riverbanks. And we've also broken these objectives into discrete tasks so that we're not trying to lump everything into one objective, but it's very clear what each objective aims to accomplish. And you can see we modified that second objective from planting 1,000 plants to 1 million plants to 2,000 to make it more realistic. All right, now we're going to get into the project description. The most important thing you need to do when writing a grant application is to describe your project well. One thing you can know for sure is that if the person reviewing your grant is confused about the project will not get funded, so you must be clear. Because this is so important to successful grant writing, we're going to spend a big chunk of time today talking about how to successfully communicate your project in your grant proposal. There's a lot of different writing styles you may need to use in your professional career. Each one has its own approach. For instance, you may be familiar with how scientific papers always start with an introduction full of background information and then go on to methods, results, and conclusions. But in grant writing, like in newspaper writing, you need to start with your conclusion or your bottom line and then give the background and context later. Just like in news writing and grant writing, you need to remember that your reviewer may stop reading at any point, or if they don't completely stop reading, they may switch from reading to skimming. So you have to assume that people may stop reading the proposal, but your goal is to keep them reading. So just like with the newspaper story, the most important thing to do when describing your project, or for that matter, answering any of the grant questions, is to not bury the lead. Make sure your reviewer knows what the project is and why it should be done from the very first sentence. Are you going to prepare a plan, acquire a piece of property, build a trail, or restore a wetland? It doesn't matter how complicated your project is, you need to be able to describe the core essence of the project and why it should be done in 1 to 2 sentences. You can get into the details and nuances later in the proposal, but you need to start with the most important facts right at the beginning. So now we're going to do another interactive activity where you are the grant reviewers. We're going to show you 3 project summaries that we have received, and you tell us which project you would be most likely to fund based on the information in the summary. Now, before I show these project summaries to you, I'm going to tell you that these summaries had to fit into a set space on our application form that allows only about 4 lines of text and 1 to 2 sentences. So I'm going to bring these up and give you a chance to read them, and then we'll put up a poll so you can vote on them. So here's the first of the project summaries, Johnston Marsh. And number 2 is West End Park. I'll give you a little longer to read that one. And then number 3, a little longer still, for Elsa Hendricks Park. Okay, so now we're going to put up the poll. And you can vote for either number 1, Johnston Marsh Plan, number 2, West End Park, or number 3, Elsa Hendricks Park. Okay, we're just going to give you a little time to vote. And maybe we can go ahead and close the poll. Sorry for any of you who are still waiting in line to vote there. It looks like we have a landslide for number 2. West End Park is the winner, which is great because that definitely corresponds with what we thought. I'm going to just tell you a little bit about what we thought the issues were with each of these project summaries now. The first one about Johnston Marsh, it's unclear what the project is or why it would be done. So, and got very few votes, so that seemed to fit well. Our form leaves quite a bit more room for the project summary, so that was a missed opportunity for that applicant. The second project summary about West End Park is pretty good. It tells us specific habitats that will be restored and how many acres of each. It tells us that it is in a disadvantaged community. That was one of the Conservancy scoring criteria for this grant program. And it also tells us that the applicant has thought about sea level rise. My one recommendation would be that rather than start the summary, the first sentence with the phrase, grant funds will restore, it should have started with the name of the applicant. For example, the Central Bay Land Trust will restore. The third project summary about Elsa Hendricks Park has some helpful information, but it also has some problems. First of all, there's no clear statement of what the project is. The reader can figure out that the restoration involves planting 20 acres of ruderal habitat, so that's better than nothing, but it's unclear what type of habitat will be created, what will be planted. The project also seems to involve the installation of trails and signs, but because of how the sentence is worded, this is not entirely clear, and there's no quantification as to how much trail, how many signs. The second issue is that the summary uses an acronym, GDP, that has not been defined. We can assume that it does not stand for Gross Domestic Product, but your reviewer may not know what it does stand for. So remember, don't use undefined acronyms, and in general, you probably want to avoid using acronyms too much. The third problem is that the summary went longer than the space provided on our form. Therefore, from the reviewer's perspective, it just runs out in the middle of a sentence. Now, if this form is viewed electronically, there is a way to scroll down and see the rest of the text, but if it's printed out, the text gets cut off. So in a situation like that, as the applicant, if there's a specified box size, you want to assume that the form is going to be printed out and try your best to keep that in mind and restrict your answer to the available space. Okay. So we're telling you that it's very important that you be able to describe the core facts of your project right from the get-go. So one thing you might want to do before starting a grant proposal is to try this exercise. Take your project description, whatever length or format you have it, and then pare it down to one paragraph, and then to one sentence that really communicates the most important elements of your project. If you do this, you can return to the paragraph and sentence over and over while writing your grant proposal to make sure you keep your proposal focused and clear. And then to go even further, you can think about the project name. The project name should also try to communicate core information about the project. So let's give this exercise a try now. We emailed out to all of you, and I know there was some problem with those emails. Maybe not everyone received them, but we did try to email out to everybody a project description that we received for one of our project rounds that we thought was well done. So we just want to give a shout out to the Big Sur Land Trust for letting us use the Car Lake property acquisition as an example. So here's the longer project description, a section of that project description, which we'll be drawing from for our one paragraph summary. There's no one right way to do this, but here are some of the key facts that should get pulled out when you're parsing this down to one paragraph. First, we have in yellow, what is the project? Acquisition of Car Lake and Salinas, so that also covers where it is. And with any project, you want to quantify it when possible. So we also want to pull out the fact that it's 73 acres. Second, in green, we have why the project is needed or important. What are its benefits? Here you can see the benefits are bulleted, which makes them easy to find. Down below those bullets, there's a more detailed discussion of them, but because we're summarizing right now, we're going to let go of that detail and save it for later in the proposal. Then in blue, we have who will be carrying out the project, who is the lead, and who are the partners. In this excerpt that we provided, it was not abundantly clear that the Big Sur Land Trust is the lead, but that's mainly because we took this section out of context from a larger application. Then there's that long list of project partners. This list is too long to keep as is in a one paragraph description, so you would need to figure out how best to pare that down. Finally, in red, we have why this is a unique high priority project. The statement here about this being the first opportunity to protect any part of Car Lake in a century answers that question. So we want to combine all of those pieces into a single paragraph, and here is the result. It's not the only way you can do this, but this is one way. You can see, because this is an acquisition project, it's fairly easy to describe what the project will do. So in this paragraph, we spent more time emphasizing why the project was important and timely. The number of project partners is impressive, so we didn't want to lose that information entirely. But in this one paragraph description, we had to lump partners into categories rather than naming them individually. If you were to start your grant application with this paragraph, you would still want to provide the specifics of all the project partners, as well as more details on the need and benefits, but you could do that later in the application. If your reviewer only read this first paragraph, they would still get the important gist of the project. So based on that description that we gave you, here's what we came up with when we tried to pare this down to a single sentence. The Big Sur Land Trust will acquire the 73-acre Car Lake property as a first step to creating an urban oasis within the city of Salinas that will provide recreation, flood control, wetland habitat, and build climate change resiliency. Sounds great, right? In this one sentence, we managed to capture the who, what, where, and why of the project. And now, here is our handy formula for an opening sentence you can use in just about any grant application. You start with the who, how much you're asking for, what you're going to do, and why you're going to do it. So here's an example of how we did that for one of the proposals that we submitted here at the Conservancy to the Department of Fish and Wildlife. And you can see in that example, we also added the funding program that we were applying to. Okay, moving on to the project name. It may not matter what we call a rose, but it matters what you name your project. Keep in mind that your project name is your first chance to communicate with a potential funder about your project. So here's a few tips on project name. Keep it short and simple. 6 words is a good maximum. From the granting agency's perspective, the project name is going to be used in forms, databases, reports, etc. So it needs to be short and sweet. No colons. You may have been told to use colons in academic papers, but don't use them in grant writing if you can avoid it. Start with the place name. Convey the core essence of what the project is. Wetland restoration or trail plan is a good thing to make part of the name. And if you can, be memorable, but don't do this at the expense of being short and simple and conveying the basic gist of your project. Here's an example of how a project name evolved over time in our office. It started out as the Odello East Enhancement Project. This tells you almost nothing about the project unless you happen to know where Odello East is. It moved on to become the Lower Carmel River Floodplain Restoration Project. Now the name gives you a sense of what the project is. This is a perfectly good project name. But our grantee later changed it to the Carmel River Floodplain Restoration and Ecological Enhancement Project, which I believe is possibly 1 word over the 6-word limit, but it's also a perfectly reasonable name. And the reason that this name is better than the old name is that it can be condensed to Carmel River Free, which makes it very memorable and can help build buzz. People talk about it, and that can build momentum. So I am now going to pass it over to Evan to talk to you about project need.
All right, thank you. So now that we've talked about getting to the core of your project, we want to provide some more tips on talking about why the project is needed and what the benefits will be. Obviously, this is an important factor for a funder who is deciding which projects to fund. On the Conservancy's application, our very first question is about the project need. And somewhat surprisingly, this seems to be a very difficult question for grant writers to answer well. We get a lot of long, unclear answers to this section, and we have heard from other funding agencies that this is also a common problem for them. In short, please give your funder a clear and simple statement of your project need. In the approximate words of Jerry Maguire, this will help us help you. Grant applications can have many different ways to address project need. Sometimes you will be asked to state the problem that will be addressed, or describe the project need, or describe the benefits of the project. In general, we recommend that the answer to any of these questions include the problem, a brief restatement of the solution, aka your project, and then the benefits. Within this context, we have some more advice. Let me reiterate the core themes that Joel touched on. Don't bury the lead. If the application asks what problem will be addressed, the very first sentence should state that problem. It may be more complicated than can fit in a sentence, but your job is to pare it down to the core problem and make it fit in 1 sentence. You can elaborate later. The second is be clear and concise. If you are asked to describe the project benefits, consider listing them as bullets. You can elaborate on each one in subsequent text, but make sure the reader gets most of the important points right away. Start specific, not global. For instance, if your project is to restore a degraded wetland, don't start by saying that California has lost 90% of its wetlands. We all do that, but starting with what is wrong at that particular wetland is much better than starting global. Later, you can put it into the larger context if that is helpful. Here's another example. If you're doing a project to improve water efficiency at farms in a region, don't start with the economic importance of agriculture in that region. Start with information about the impact of the lack of water. Perhaps there is not enough water for salmon in adjacent creeks, or the local groundwater aquifer is being overpumped. If you want to talk about the economic importance of the project, you can, but just don't lead with that. So what does it mean to be specific? You need to, first, quantify the need and/or benefits, list specific issues and/or benefits, provide context for your project, and be unique. So that quantification means being numeric. For instance, suppose you want to build a bathroom along the beach in Happy Town. In order to make the case of why an agency should fund this, you should provide numeric information like how many people use the beach in Happy Town every month or year? How far is it to the closest bathroom? You also need to list specific issues and/or benefits of your project to demonstrate project need. It is not enough to say that your project will restore a creek. You need to explain what that restoration will mean. Let's say, for instance, that your project will remove levees to restore a creek's connection with its floodplain. In that case, you need to make sure to specify that the creek will in fact be reconnected with its floodplain. But also you want to go beyond that. You want to describe the specific benefits of reconnecting the creek to its floodplain, which I have listed some examples here. You also want to provide context for your project in the project needs section. If you are doing a trail project, you need to say how many miles of trail will be built, but you also want to put that in context. If it's an urban area, you may want to say how many people live within a half mile of that trail, or if it connects to existing trails, then include information on how many miles of trail in total will be available. And of course, you want to highlight what is unique or special about your project. Basically, what makes your proposal stand out from the rest? Is it the last barrier to be removed on a river? Will it provide benefits to a community that is low income or typically overlooked? Will it pilot a new method or technology that might be replicable elsewhere? Or is it the final remaining acquisition project needed to restore the largest coastal wetland complex in Southern California, like the example I've listed here? One important thing to remember is to not oversell your project. This sets off alarm bells for the reviewers. If you have quantified your benefits, we will know what the project will do. You don't have to tell us it will save the world. For example, on the Conservancy's Prop 1 application, there is a list of 11 potential objectives your project can contribute towards. If an applicant checks every one of those, this makes the reviewer wonder if the applicant is exaggerating and could lead to a loss of applicant credibility. All right, so now we're going to do another poll. This is the actual first paragraph we have received in the project needs section on a past proposal. We know that this paragraph is long to read, but try to read it quickly and pretend that you have 40 more just like it to read, so you can really see it from the funder's perspective. I'll give you another minute to read this paragraph, and then I will show you in the poll, some answers of what the actual project need was of the project, and you will select the best one. So we will show the poll, and I will read the responses or the answers. Oh, a little bit more time to read the paragraph. Okay, starting the poll. So your responses are either reduced risk to drinking water sources, reduced bacteria and impaired water bodies, reduced impacts to wildlife, improve water quality in Big City Creek, or all of the above. Choose which one you think is the project need of this project based on what they provided in their proposal.
Go ahead.
All right, we're going to close the poll. I think that this was difficult to read a paragraph so long pretty quickly, which elucidates the point of that this paragraph might not have been as clear and concise as a reviewer would have liked it to be. I'm showing the results, and we have quite a mix of responses, which I think makes sense compared because basically this wasn't a very well written paragraph demonstrating need. So the actual project need of this project was improve water quality in Big City Creek. However, as the funder, when we got to the end of this paragraph, we had no idea what the need of the project actually was, which is a major problem. Additionally, this project never, or this paragraph never mentioned the site name Big City Creek. Now we're going on to an example that is demonstrating a well-written paragraph addressing project need in terms of both the problem and the beneficial outcomes. So first, it restates the project description of constructing 2.5 acres of living shoreline in San Diego Bay. It then establishes the immediate need of the project, which is that shallow habitats have been lost and inshore areas are vulnerable. Next, it illustrates this project's proposed solution of protecting inshore areas from extreme events and flooding via wetland accretion and oyster reefs. And last, it identifies specific benefits of the project, including restoring habitats that are important to species of concern for that funding agency. So that's a good example. There are many other sections within grant proposals that we don't have time to get in today, but everything we've already discussed applies to those other sections. Some of these sections will be where you can provide that detailed information that you didn't get to include in your project description or need. However, even when answering detailed questions, you should still be concise and direct. For instance, similar to developing a project description and need, you must answer grant questions concisely, simply, and directly. A useful tip for answering a grant question is to simply repeat the question, add the word because, and write your answer. While you're not going to be able to demonstrate your poetic skills, you'll provide the funder with a clear and direct answer to their question using this format. Topic sentences are also key in providing answers longer than one sentence. Using topic sentence to guide your response and only providing the information that supports that sentence is a good idea. One more useful tip is that during the writing process, mark each topic sentence in red and make sure that you're only including information that supports that red sentence. But please remember to remove the red markings before submitting your proposal. More generally, remember to be consistent in your language by using those key words you identified as important in the beginning of your grant writing process, and don't be afraid to reiterate key themes. Yes, you don't want to be overly redundant, but reminding the funder of what your project is and why it's important is a good practice to an extent. Remember, the funders are reading many proposals and need help to remember the importance of your unique project. Now we will take another poll to see which of these two examples best answer the question, the grant question. This question comes directly from our Prop 1 RFP. The question is, describe how the project is consistent with best available science. Your first option is, the Clean Water Project will construct a variety of SCMs such as dry wells, bioswales, and infiltration galleries, and will be using innovative techniques and emerging technologies. All right, the second question, or the second answer to the same question is on the screen now, and I will give you a little bit longer to read this paragraph. All right, hopefully that was a good amount of time. We are going to start the poll. and you can answer which answer you thought best addressed the best available science question in our Conservancy Prop 1 application. All right, we're getting votes in. Great, we're getting a really consistent response, and most of you have voted, so I think we can close the vote and share the results. As you can see, almost everybody chose answer 2, which is the one we also agree with. So going back to the PowerPoint, hide. All right, so just to give you a little, will you click on the? All right, going back to answer 1, this response was not sufficient because it did not say why those techniques were using the best available science. Was there a research study done demonstrating their effectiveness? Was there a science advisory committee that reviewed all of the possible options and selected these ones? Or do these methods come from a science-based plan? Further, using innovative technology is not necessarily synonymous with using the best available science. And furthermore, the Conservancy in the Prop 1 RFP provides a separate section for addressing that innovative technology. Whereas answer 2 provided more necessary detail to demonstrate that the applicant had consulted with various academic institutions in developing their methods, as well as scientifically testing those methods with their academic partners in the field. Although this may seem verbose compared to our suggestions of being direct and concise in other parts of the proposal, this section is an area where you must provide all the necessary detail to adequately answer the question at hand. This may be especially important for new innovative projects that may be unfamiliar to your funder, particularly in justifying project elements like high monitoring costs or the need for experimentation within a project. Addressing all of the listed scoring criteria within an RFP is essential to scoring high enough to qualify for funding. You might assume that if you answer all of the questions within the RFP that you have in turn addressed all of the scoring criteria. This is not necessarily true. Remember to review all of the scoring criteria several times throughout the writing process to confirm that they have been addressed somewhere in the proposal. A useful tip is to ensuring that this happens is to write a number of each of the criteria next to the sentence that addresses that criteria within the proposal. Then once you have checked that each one has been addressed, remember to delete the numbers before submitting your proposal to your funding agency. For example, in our Prop 1 application, one of the scoring criteria is the extent to which the applicant demonstrates experience successfully implementing similar projects or demonstrates appropriate and necessary partnerships to complete the project. There is no specific question within our RFP that addresses this criterion, so you yourself must make sure that you demonstrate your entity's experience and capability to complete the project somewhere in the proposal. For this particular criteria, it might be best to include the explanation under the project and applicant history section. After you have described your project and project need, you will need to tell the funder how you will accomplish your objectives. This is done by developing a clear list of tasks and is another challenge many grant writers face. The tasks should tell the funder what activities you will undertake, how you will do them, and how long they will take. Let's go through some examples. This is an example of a task list that is way too detailed. Many of these tasks could be combined to be more general categories. For instance, tasks 1 through 3 of reporting, direct admin, and contract admin could all be combined into one administrative task. Whereas this example is not detailed enough. What does implementation mean? Is that just the construction costs? Does it include implementation of the education and outreach component as well? This task list needs many more details. Whereas this task list is just right. So this is an example of a well-balanced list. There's 7 tasks and they range from planning to construction to monitoring. Once you have defined your tasks, you will need to tell the funder how much each task will cost. For this section of the webinar, I will focus on how to present budget information in your proposal, including the level of detail required in a budget, the basis of the budget or the justifications of your costs, how to show leverage versus matching funds, and then what are acceptable costs. So how detailed should you make your budget? As a reviewer, I am looking to a budget to answer three main questions. The first question, what will grant money be spent on? For this question, I want to see a summary budget that gives me a good sense of how much of the budget is going to project management versus construction versus monitoring. The second question is, are the project costs reasonable and justifiable? For this question, I want to see a detailed budget that gives some indication of the basis of project costs. So it helps me to see a budget or budgets that answer both of these questions. Here's an example of a summary budget. Although this budget is divided into more general tasks than we would have recommended, it's a good example as these tasks are pretty easy to understand. Remember to make sure that the tasks in your budget exactly correspond to the tasks in your narrative within the project proposal. You also want to use round numbers in a summary budget like this. You want to be able to track your budget and not have to worry about going down to the penny later on. And additionally, most funders will accept a little bit of flexibility if your budget slightly changes from this stage to from what was submitted to later when you're contracting. The summary budget is also a good place to show matching funds. Remember that I said I look to a budget for three questions. The third question is what matching or leveraging monies will be funding the project. Including those funds in a summary budget is good, so you don't have to assign the funds to very specific subtasks. You can also show matching funds in a separate table if you don't want to assign them to specific tasks. This detailed budget provides a basis for the overall cost assigned to each task. It communicates to a funder that your budget numbers are sound and well-founded. Some funders ask for a high level of specificity in proposal budgets, and you may not have much choice in the format or detail you provide. The Conservancy and some other funders don't require a lot of detail or specify a detailed format, but we still want to have a sense of where your budget numbers are coming from and how they are justified. In addition to a budget table, you will often want to provide at least a limited budget narrative. This is a good place to provide funders with more information on a few budget-related issues. For instance, if there are any unusual items or high costs in your budget, you should explain them here. Additionally, if your budget includes other funding sources that you have applied for but haven't secured yet, you should explain any contingency plans in case they don't come through. Are there other grants you will go after, or can the project be implemented in a phased approach? Funders understand that you don't always have all of your funding in place when you're applying to them, but we also don't want to tie up grant funds for a project that may not be implemented anytime soon. Finally, in the budget narrative, you want to include a brief explanation of where your budget numbers come from. That could be as simple as saying that the budget is an engineering cost estimate, or that you have implemented a lot of similar projects and are confident about what the cost will be like. So now, match versus leveraging funds. When I say matching funds, I am referring to other funds that are required by a grant program. Typically, a grant program will require a certain kind and percentage of matching funds. For example, some federal programs require that 50% of the total project cost is funded by non-federal funds. In these cases, you should be careful not to double count match funds for more than one proposal. That is usually not allowed. You should also be careful not to commit more match than you need to meet the requirement or to maximize your score under the ranking criteria, because you might need those matching funds in other grant programs. You are also obligating your organization to provide that amount or ratio of matching funds. You don't want to make that obligation any harder to meet than you have to, in case things change with your expected match funds. For leverage, you should show all of the outside funds you expect to use for the project. It will make a good impression to see how much you are leveraging the grant funds you are requesting. For the Coastal Conservancy, in our Prop 1 RFP, we don't require match, but we do award points for non-state match only. And again, you should indicate whether you have funds that are secured or pending. The RFP should tell you if certain costs aren't allowable. For example, state bond funds can't be spent on refreshments, so food for volunteers, while is a reasonable project cost, is not allowable for grant programs funded by state bonds. Many grant programs, including the Coastal Conservancies, allow indirect costs or overhead to be included, but there are often specific rules or caps on how to charge overhead or indirect. Make sure that most of your budget is going towards tasks that fit the grant program's main goals. Some categories may be allowable, but funders don't want to see too much of that grant going to that category. For example, everyone understands that monitoring is a necessary part of doing a project, but most funders don't want to see too large a percentage of a grant going to fund monitoring. And finally, we have created a no-brainer checklist for your use, and I will quickly go through those items. First, start early. Make sure to allow time to create or secure all of the required information, including support letters, maps, photos, etc. Secondly, read the instructions all the way through and follow those instructions. That includes the format. Submit your application on time and pay attention to time differences with your grantors in different states. There may be a hard copy that is required that you need to be mailing, and they need to receive it by a specific time. Answer all of the questions that are listed in the RFP and make sure to address all of the selection criteria, whether or not there's a specific question about them. Remember to define all of your acronyms and get the funder's name correct. There has been many times where we receive grant proposals here at the Conservancy that are addressed to the Coastal Commission, and we love our sister agency, but we are in fact the Coastal Commission. So this seems...
Oh, no, we're the Coastal Conservancy.
Oh no, I just did it! See, there you go. So even I have to check myself. And remember to accept the track changes before submitting your application. Now I will hand it back over to Joel for our conclusion and to answer any questions.
So for our final slide, we just wanted to remind you of some of the key points from the webinar. Remember, when you're writing the proposal, don't bury the lead. Be concise, but provide necessary detail, and don't oversell your project. And we've included one final cartoon to remind you that intense competition for government grants is not new, but goes back at least as far as the presidency of U.S. Grant. So thanks for attending the webinar. I think, do we have some time to answer questions now?
We do not at the moment have any questions. Wait, we just got one. Can you provide a PDF copy of your slides to participants? Yes, we will be doing that. We will email out the slides and the notes. And then we are also going to, hopefully, we will have successfully recorded the presentation, in which case we'll post it on our website and let you know about that.
Oh, and before we go on with any more questions, people should feel free to type them in. I did just want to mention that we will be sending out to all the participants a little survey about how the webinar was, how useful it was for you, and whether you have any suggestions for future topics for webinars and so on. We do plan to offer more webinars in the future, and we'll let people know when we have solidified those plans.
So we just got another question in as to whether you can use in-kind as matching funds. And that's very agency and grant program specific. So that's one of the things when you're looking at the details of the RFP, you'd want to look at and see whether or not you can.
Right. I believe for the Conservancy's Prop 1 solicitations, I think you can use in-kind as part of the non-state match funds, but I wouldn't swear to that, but I think that's the case.
And just know that if you do use in-kind, you'd have to clearly document that. For instance, if it's staff time, you'd have to have clear records of the staff time that's spent on that project.
Yeah, and then it's helpful in the proposal, again, to give a good basis for what that in-kind contribution would be. There's a helpful, you know, if you're using volunteer time for your in-kind, which many nonprofits do, one helpful resource to mention is a website called Independent Sector, which provides an annual valuation of what a volunteer hour is worth, and they actually provide specific value of that hour by state. So that can be a useful thing to look at, Independent Sector.
We have another question about confusion about double counting on matching funds. Joel, do you want to explain?
What that means?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. It just simply means that for many agencies, if they're asking you to provide match for their grant, then they want to know, and they often require a statement that says these funds were not used to match a different federal grant. So if you use the same state funds to match two federal grants, most federal agencies would consider that double counting, and they wouldn't want that. They wouldn't allow that.
So there's also a question about when is the Conservancy's next call for projects. So we currently have 2 RFPs out, one for our Explore the Coast grant program, and those applications are due October 7th, and the other for Proposition 1 funding programs, those applications are due September 30th. You should look on our website for details on both. We're not going to go into them today. And then we also have other funding that we give out on an ongoing basis. So you should look at our website and contact the regional manager for the geographic region you're in if you have a project that you'd like to talk to us at the Coastal Conservancy about, and we can help you on that. There's another question about, is it okay to abbreviate the project name as project throughout the narrative, or should it be abbreviated to something identifiable?
I think it's fine within your narrative to just say the project. Lots of people do that with a capital P, so you can tell it's in the place of a proper name. And you know, I think that can be actually good at just keeping yourself from having to repeat the whole project name or use an acronym that might be clunky. So yeah, use project.
So there's another question about how you can find the grading criteria for non-government organizations like foundations. And the reality is a lot of foundations are a little bit of a black box about how they score or make their decisions. And many of them don't publish any kind of scoring criteria. Your best bet in that is, one, to build a relationship beforehand with the foundation and find out from them what they're looking for, or I would say look at their strategic plan and other things they may have published that would tell you what their priorities are and what they're looking for. But it's usually not as clear as it will be with a government grant program.
Right, and I would just add, it's also good to look at other projects that they've funded, and that can give you a general idea. But again, it doesn't give you the specificity of having to find criteria.
So somebody has also made the suggestion that if your project isn't funded, to follow up with the funder and try to find out why, so that if you want to reapply for that, then you can make adjustments to your application to address those concerns. So I think that's excellent advice.
Right, we've definitely had people at the who submitted a project to the Conservancy that we didn't fund, and then changed it, and it got funded in a future round. So I agree that that's good advice. Some agencies are really good about providing very detailed feedback, so you should always ask for it.
There's a question here that I don't quite understand. It says, can we apply for a coastal commission, e.g. whale tail with program overlap as CCC? So I don't think we understand that question. If you want to write in more details, we can try to answer it. We don't run the whale tail program. That is the Coastal Commission.
But I will say that I've managed projects that received funding from the Conservancy as well as receiving a commission whale tail grant. So if that's what you're getting at, that's certainly possible.
There's a question regarding the idea of having a contingency plan if your project is not fully funded as requested. Can one of you go into a little more detail on what you might actually say in the text of the grant application?
Okay, so again, you might say, we've applied, we have applications into these different sources that are pending. If we don't secure the needed funding from those sources where we've already submitted proposals, we also anticipate submitting proposals to these other sources we've identified that are a good fit for the project. You could also say, if raising the necessary funds takes longer than we anticipated, we can implement the project in a phased way. So we can do this first section of the project that will have an independent utility before we've secured all the necessary funds. Some funders actually will specifically ask you to let them know if you can do something with partial funding. You submit a budget and you say, this is what we need to do the whole project. If necessary, we can do the first couple years if we have this amount of funding, for example.
There's another question that asks about having a place name, that it should be a more widely recognized place name. So not like the Smith property, but at the location where the Smith property is. I think that's generally a good idea. In part because, especially with acquisitions, we end up having a lot of acquisitions change name, where they start with us with the name of the owner, like the Smith property, and later it gets changed to the beautiful Redwood State Park, and then it gets called both names. But if you do use the specific property name, another option is to put a more geographic place name in parentheses, perhaps at the end of it, or somehow work that in. Any other ideas on that?
I think you covered it.
Yeah. How important are letters of support, and what are some key features of letters of support?
Well, that's an interesting question. I've seen some requests for proposals that actually ask you not to include letters of support. So it's really, that's something that, again, you want to pay attention to the request for proposals. And then some other requests for proposals say you need letters, but only letters from people who are actually contributing funding or in-kind support to your project to document that they're actually going to be doing that. It varies, in short, but I know here at the Conservancy, when we're initially getting in proposals, we don't need to see lots of letters of support. The only time when I think it would be really important for us at the proposal stage to see some letters of support is when the project may be controversial in some way, and we want to know that the relevant politicians or agencies who would need to be involved actually are on board with the project. But otherwise, at the proposal stage, it's going to vary by your proposal. Some people want to see that kind of support, and they want to see it from a broad, different group of organizations. And other people would rather that they don't have to deal with more material that you're submitting. But again, keeping your proposal simpler and leaving out those letters of support until perhaps their board has to make some kind of official determination, at which point they might want, like with the Conservancy, that's the stage where we would really need to see some letters of support for sure.
I think also in terms of the content in the letter, it can be quite simple. It doesn't have to go into detail at all.
And most people don't mind if you know, typically when you're writing a proposal and you're asking for a letter of support, the person you're asking doesn't really want to write it themselves, so you send it out to them. And it's typically fine with funders to see that the letters all look almost exactly the same. It's really just a question of who you got them from.
Okay, another question is, what is a good response when funders ask, how will this project become financially sustainable without funder continuing to fund it? So I'll take a first stab at it. So I think that with, for instance, if you're buying a piece of land that's going to become a park, then it's important that you have a plan lined up for who will manage and maintain the park. And saying that. But if you have a more ongoing project like a education program that happens every year, it's not going to be possible for you to say this is how the project is going to be funded 5 years from now, really specifically. But you should have like a general plan. For instance, we expect 50% to come from participant fees, 20% to come from foundations, and we'll be pursuing government grants for the other 30%, or something like that. Some plan that means you've thought it out. It doesn't mean that you wouldn't come back to that funder necessarily, unless they tell you not to. But with ongoing programs like that, that's just the reality. You have to do ongoing fundraising, and a funder who doesn't understand that is confused about the kind of project you have. Anybody else want to add to that? That's good. So somebody asked whether you can send a proposal to multiple agencies, or is it best to send it to just one and see it as funded before sending it to another one?
I would say I've actually submitted proposals to multiple agencies. Typically what I do in that case is I make sure the agencies are all aware that I'm submitting multiple proposals. I don't typically write that into the proposal, but I'll contact those other funders and let them know. And typically what they have told me is, that's fine, just let us know if you receive funding, if you get an award from a funder, and that's, you know, that means that you don't need our funding anymore. Let us know as soon as possible, because it could mean that we won't have to spend the time reviewing your proposal, for example, and certainly we don't want to award you the funding if you don't need it anymore. So it's okay to do that, and people understand that you need to get your funding lined up, and sometimes you can't wait and do them one at a time because of that, but you just want to be considerate about letting people know and communicating with them if you find out that you don't need their funding anymore.
And also, just to clarify, that you should probably not be sending the same proposal to each agency, because you want to tailor that proposal to the specific interests of that funder and the specific criteria in the program, et cetera. So it should be slightly modified to be specific to them. So I think maybe we've answered all the questions that we have on here.
All right.
Yeah. So.
Well, thanks again so much for joining the webinar, and yeah, we hope it'll be great to get back responses to the survey we're going to send out, and hopefully we'll hear from you again, and you can join a future webinar that we offer.
Great. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Bye.